The Stranger from Gibraltar. Chapter 1. The Ledger. The solicitor's waiting room smelled of mildew and old ambition, and Captain Inez Carvalho had been sitting in it for 40 minutes past her appointed hour. She had arrived in London 11 weeks ago with 3 trunks, a leather satchel of documents, and the address of the firm of Whitmore and Sons, who had handled the English portion of her late husband's trading interests for 6 years. She had been to their offices 4 times. She had been received on each occasion by a clerk who was polite and progressively more uncomfortable, and she had not once been received by either Whitmore or any of his sons. The documents she carried were clear. The partnership agreement between her late husband, Captain Rodrigo Carvalho, and his English associate, Mr. Hugh Baxter, gave her, as the inheriting party, a half share in a property at Endlewick in Devonshire that the partnership had acquired in 1809. Mr. Baxter had died 2 years before Rodrigo, leaving a widow who had sold his half to a developer called Marsh, without informing anyone on the Carvalho side. Inez had discovered this in Lisbon 8 months after Rodrigo's death, in a document that had required help to read because it was written in the particular English that commercial lawyers used, and that was as remote from the English she spoke as a foreign language. She had spent 6 months arranging her affairs, settling the Lisbon debts, closing the shipping office on the quay, finding a tenant for the house above the harbour, before booking passage to Southampton. The London professionals she had encountered since her arrival had handled her with the specific combination of courtesy and circumvention that she had come to understand was what London offered a foreign widow without a male guardian, available on paper, inaccessible in practice. She was directed to clerks, to assistants, to the recommendation, repeated with the frequency of a prescription, that she appoint an English solicitor to act on her behalf. This advice she had declined 6 times on the grounds that appointing someone to manage what she was capable of managing herself would be both expensive and insulting. She was also aware that appointing a representative would convert her, in the eyes of every subsequent professional, from a party with a claim into an abstraction behind a name, and she had been managing her own affairs for 2 years and did not intend to become an abstraction now. She was also aware, making herself easy. She had decided that being easy was not what was required of her. On the 41st minute, the door opened and a man came out who was not a clerk. He was perhaps 35, lean, with the quality of economical movement that came from years of outdoor work. He looked, on seeing her, neither uncomfortable nor unsurprised. "Mrs. Carvalho," he said. "Captain Carvalho," she said. "My husband was Captain Rodrigo Carvalho. I held a master's certificate for 6 years and have not yet found occasion to retire it." He absorbed this without the visible recalibration downward. "My apologies," he said, and meant it, which was different from the apologetic phrases she had been collecting for 11 weeks. "I am Thomas Holt. I handle property transactions for Whitmore's." He paused, choosing between the managed version and the true one. "The Endlewick matter was referred to me when it became apparent the firm had not handled your correspondence as it should have." "They did not handle it at all," she said. "They received it and did not reply." "Yes," he said. "I know. Will you come in?" He had the documents organized, not merely filed but reconstructed, the history of the matter laid out from the beginning with the willingness to show what had been done wrong. Her 4 unanswered letters sat on top with a separate notation that they were unanswered. He had the Marsh sale agreement, the original partnership deed, and a letter she had not seen before, written by Mr. Baxter's widow to Whitmore and Sons at the time of the Marsh sale, asking whether notification to the Carvalho party was required. The guidance had been provided. The guidance had been wrong. The Carvalho interest was registered under Portuguese Commercial Code and enforceable under the bilateral trade agreement of 1810. An English solicitor had read the partnership deed, identified the Portuguese registration, checked the treaty, or failed to check it, and told a widow that she had no obligation to inform the surviving partner of a sale that directly affected his interest. The widow had acted accordingly. 2 years had elapsed. Rodrigo had died. Inez had arrived. "Who wrote the guidance?" she said. "Mr. Whitmore himself, 3 years ago." He met her gaze. "I do not know whether he was carelessly wrong or deliberately wrong. I want to be honest about the boundary of what I know." She looked at him steadily. He had been watching her read with the neutral attention of a man who has laid out the evidence and is waiting to see what the person receiving it concludes. Not managing her reaction, not monitoring it for the purpose of adjusting his position, simply waiting. "The Marsh sale is challengeable," he continued. "You have a legitimate claim to compensation for your half share at the time of sale, plus income generated since. The challenge will require English legal representation. I can provide introductions to 2 firms I believe will take the matter honestly." "Why 2? "Because you should choose," he said. "Not be assigned." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, the London morning was conducting its indifferent operations, carriages, vendors, the general noise of a city that had no particular opinion about a Portuguese widow in a solicitor's waiting room. Among everything in the folder, the reconstructed history, the treaty provision, the 2 introductions, was this, the letter he had written 3 weeks ago, addressed to her, not to a guardian she did not have, not to a male representative she had not appointed, to Captain I. Carvalho. It was the first correspondence from an English professional to do this, and she had noted it the morning it arrived with a care she had not examined too closely. "Thursday," she said. "I will be here at 9. "I will be here at 8:30, he said, "to prepare." She went out into the London morning and thought about the organised desk and the addressed letter, and thought, "He sent it to me." Chapter 2. The Property. The meetings with the 2 legal firms happened on Thursday and Friday. Inez conducted both with Thomas present, not as her advocate, but as the person who held the Whitmore file. She watched him in both meetings and noted that he was marginally less careful with his professional neutrality in the first, which told her something about that firm. The second firm's principal, Mr. Croft, had asked her 3 questions and listened to her answers. She chose Croft. "The second question," Thomas said when she told him. "Yes," she said. "You saw it." "I thought you would see it," he said. "I would have chosen the same." They were standing in the street outside Croft's offices in the October afternoon, and she was aware of a shift in the exchange. The shift from "this man is useful" to "this man is interesting," which was a different category. "I want to see Endlewick before the proceedings begin," she said. "I want to know what I am claiming." He wrote to Marsh's factor that day. The factor, not yet knowing a challenge was coming, replied agreeably and arranged an inspection for Wednesday. Thomas came to her Southwark lodgings at 7, the hour she had specified, and they drove to Devonshire through the October landscape. She sat across from him in the carriage, and they talked for 3 hours. She had not expected to talk for 3 hours. She had expected a professional exchange about the property's history and Marsh's development and current valuation. That was what the conversation was on its surface, but it was also the conversation of 2 people who had spent 10 days in each other's professional company and had each been conducting an assessment that had begun to move beyond the professional question. She told him about Rodrigo. Not the formal account, but the actual one. 20 years of building something in the spaces between the dangers the sea and commerce and the war kept placing in their path. She told him about the last voyage and the fever that had taken Rodrigo in Madeira in June of 1812, and the months afterward in which she had managed grief and estate and debts and correspondence simultaneously because there was no one else to do any of it. He listened with the full attention she had identified in the solicitor's office, not the performed kind, the actual kind. "You have been here 11 weeks alone," he said. "With Mrs. Farrow," she said, "who is formidable but not useful in this specific matter." "It should not have been necessary for you to come at all," he said. The matter should have been resolved by correspondence. He paused, and then said the thing he had been saying since the first meeting, the true version, rather than the convenient one. I want to be honest about why it wasn't. The firm has clients whose interests are not always aligned with accuracy. The Endlewick matter was not the first time I had identified a problem. What happened the other times? The first time, Mr. Whitmore explained that my assessment was technically correct but commercially impractical. The second time, he thanked me for my diligence and made a decision I thought was wrong. He met her gaze. The Endlewick matter is the third time. I am aware that laying the folder out plainly for you may affect my position at the firm. And yet you did it. I made the choice I thought was right, he said. I would make it again. Inez looked at the English autumn going past the carriage window, the specific quality of English trees in October, which she had not seen before this year, and which were considerably more golden than Portuguese trees in October, which were simply wet, and thought about 11 weeks of solitude in a city that had treated her as an abstraction, and about this man who had said of course when she asked to be present, and who had laid the folder out plainly and would do it again. You should know, she said, that I intend to return to Lisbon when this is concluded. My life is there. She held his gaze with the directness she brought to everything that required it. I am telling you because the manner of your assistance has been personal in its quality, and I do not want to allow a false impression of my circumstances. He looked at her steadily. I understand. I would not ask you to alter your intentions on the basis of a professional acquaintance of 3 weeks. No, she said, I did not think you would. They were quiet after that, the quiet of two people who have put a fact in the room and left it there as what it is, not a closing, not an opening, but something laid alongside other things, for the accounting. Endlewick was a working farm, the marsh development a drainage scheme, and improved outbuildings that had materially increased the property's productive value. She walked every acre with Thomas and Marsh's factor, a decent practical man named Ada, scrupulously accurate about the facts, and made notes in her satchel, asking questions about yield and rental income and the drainage scheme's costs. Thomas asked about the legal title of the outbuildings and the documentation of the improvement expenditure. At the southern boundary, where the property ran to a line of elms, she stopped and looked back at the farmhouse and thought, I know what I am claiming. £1,000, perhaps more, after costs, sufficiency, which was what she had come for. By the time they returned to the carriage, the October light was doing its English thing, going golden and then grey in quick succession, as though it could not commit to either. Chapter 3. The Bridge. The proceedings began in November and lasted into December, and Inez attended every meeting with the focused patience of a woman who had once navigated a vessel through a 3-day storm off Cape Saint Vicente and had learned to treat extended difficulty as a problem of resource management. Croft argued with precision and handled the opposition's objections with a quiet thoroughness that justified her second question instinct. Marsh's solicitor gave ground in increments she tracked in her notebook, with the satisfaction of marking a chart. One November evening, after the day's proceedings had concluded, she and Thomas walked toward the Southwark Bridge, the direction that was not quite his and not quite hers, but was available to both without arrangement, which was how most of their November evenings had proceeded. He told her that Whitmore had made his position contingent on the proceedings, concluding without further damage to the firm's reputation, which both of them understood as meaning that the position was effectively already lost. I have been looking at other arrangements, he said. 2 firms have indicated interest. I had also considered an independent practice, a larger undertaking, but it removes the Whitmore problem entirely. The Bristol firm, she said. Do you know anyone there? One man, Ferraz, who was at Gray's Inn with a former colleague. I know a Ferraz in Lisbon, she said. A trading family. The connection may be coincidental, but it is worth establishing before you make your decision. He looked at her sideways. You are building me a connection in Bristol, I am noting a possible connection, she said precisely. The building is your work. They reached the bridge and stood at it, looking at the river that was large and grey and entirely unimpressed with the proceedings on its banks. She had been keeping an accounting about Thomas Holt since October, his manner of work and his manner of speech and the specific quality of his attention, the of course and the 8:30 preparations and the 3-hour carriage journey and the way he said I would make it again. The accounting had reached a point where the balance was clear, the clarity required a decision about what to do with it. Thomas, she said. Yes. The yes that meant, I am ready for what you are about to say. You have made the 11 weeks different from what they would have been, she said. Not only the legal matter, though that is real, the manner of it, the quality of the attention. She looked at the river. I came here as an abstraction. I will leave, as a person. The difference is largely you. She paused, because the rest of it required the plain register, and she was going to use it. I am aware that I said I would return to Lisbon and that it presents a specific difficulty for what I am finding that I feel. I mention it because you have been attempting honesty, and it seemed only fair to practice it in return. Thomas Holt stood on the Southwark Bridge in the November evening and said, I have been attempting for 6 weeks to determine the correct way to speak to you about something that is not the proceedings. I have not found a correct way, which is itself information. The honest version is that I have been thinking about you specifically and continuously since the first meeting, and that I find I am not ready for either the professional or the other quality of these months to conclude. He held her gaze, even if the conclusion is Lisbon. Even then, she said. Because what is true between us now is true, regardless of what happens after the proceedings. He looked at the river. That is the honest version. She stood in the November wind and felt the full weight of it, the accounting completed, the balance clear, the thing between them named at last by both of them, on a bridge over the Thames in the cold. It was enough. Not the resolved kind of enough, but the honest kind, the kind that knows what it is and says so without requiring it to be more than it currently is. Good evening, Thomas, she said. Good evening, Inez, he said, and her name in his voice was direct and unheld, and entirely hers. The judgment came on the 15th of December. Croft argued his closing with the precision of a man who had built a careful case and was not surprised to see it upheld. The court's reception of the Portuguese commercial registration under the 1810 treaty was exactly the reading he had advocated from the beginning, which was the reading Thomas had identified as the correct legal position in the first week of October. The judgment was in her favour, £1,340, plus Marsh's costs. Inez received it with composure, came out into the December street, and allowed herself the full feeling of a thing completed after 2 years of difficulty, the specific relief of a wrong made right, which she had not permitted herself to anticipate in case the anticipation made the possibility of failure more costly. Thomas was beside her on the steps. Congratulations, he said. I did not always believe we would get here, she said. I believed we would, he said, the settled quality of a man who has reviewed the evidence and holds his position. He was quiet for a moment. Then, when do you leave? 10 days. She had the passage booked, Mrs. Farrow packed and ready, the Southwark lodgings given notice. And you? The London firm, the smaller one. I told them yes this morning before the judgment. He paused. The judgment didn't affect the decision. The decision was about where I want to work and what kind of practice I want to have. He met her gaze. The judgment means you are returning to Lisbon with what you came for, which is the correct outcome and everything you were owed. I wanted you to know I am glad of it. She looked at him in the December cold and thought about the accounting and about what came after the beginning. Come to supper tonight, she said. Mrs. Farrow will cook. She has been waiting to cook for someone other than me for 14 weeks. Something in his expression shifted, the slight opening of a man who has been precise about himself in the presence of something that makes precision both more necessary and less possible. "Is she formidable?" "Exceptionally," she said. "She will have formed conclusions about the entirety of this situation and will share them with me afterward, not with you, which is the correct arrangement." "Yes," he said. "I'll come." Chapter 4. The Letter. She sailed from Southampton on the 25th of December in the grey morning of a winter departure, with Mrs. Farrow and 3 trunks and the leather satchel and £1,340 in a letter of credit drawn on a London bank. Thomas came to Southampton. He had mentioned on the last evening in Southwark the second supper with Mrs. Farrow, who had cooked extremely well and had said obviously at least 3 times through the door afterward, each time with the specific certainty of a woman confirming something she had concluded months ago, that he had business in Southampton. She had not asked the nature of the business. She was a woman who knew when to permit a small fiction to do its work. She also noted that the business in Southampton had been mentioned on the same evening she had confirmed the sailing date, and that these 2 facts were not unrelated. He was on the dock when the carriage arrived. Standing in the grey morning with the single bag, which she had come to understand, was not a habit of travelling light, but a habit of not encumbering himself with more than he needed, a quality she recognised from the inside, having made the same arrangement with herself in the years since Rodrigo died. "The business?" she said. "Completed early," he said. She looked at him in the grey dock morning, the wind off the water that was not the Tagus, but was the sea, which was the same everywhere in the ways that mattered. "You came," she said. "I thought the departure was a significant moment," he said, "and that significant moments are the ones it costs something to miss. I have missed enough of them." This last was said without the quality of self-reproach, simply the statement of a man who has reviewed his account and is operating with better information now. She looked at him with everything she had been keeping in the careful accounting since October, and thought about what she had told him in the carriage in Devonshire, that Lisbon was where her life was, and about whether fixed conclusions were as fixed as assumed, or whether they were habits of permanence she had constructed from genuine necessity that had since changed its shape. "The passage is 12 days," she said, "and then Lisbon, which I have been treating as a fixed conclusion." She held his gaze with the directness that was her method, and had been since before she could remember. "Rodrigo said, on a quay in Lisbon 22 years ago, at 20, that he knew what he was doing. He said it with the confidence of a young man who believed the shape of the future was determinable if you looked at it directly, and he spent 20 years proving that he had been right. I am 42. I know what I am doing with considerably more evidence than he had, and with a clearer understanding of the difference between a conclusion and an assumption I have been living inside for so long, I stopped noticing it was an assumption." Thomas was very still. "I am going to Lisbon," she said. "To do the examining I owe myself honestly, without the urgency of the proceedings, and without the daily presence of someone who makes the examining more complicated. And then I am going to write you the letter I intend to write, and we will see what the examining concludes." "I will be at the London address," he said. "I know," she said. "It is one of the things I am accounting for." She took his hand, the gesture of a sea captain who has been in enough departures to know that the dock moment is the true moment, the one that tells you what things are before the distance makes them abstract. He held it for a moment with the steadiness that was his most consistent quality, the same steadiness that had prepared the folder and said I would make it again. Then she turned and walked to the gangplank, and Mrs. Farrow came behind with the authority of a woman who has managed departures for 30 years and intends to manage this one, and the vessel moved with the purposeful unhurry of a thing that has made its decision. She stood at the stern as Southampton receded and looked at the man on the dock who had not moved, and thought about the accounting and the letter she intended, and thought about what you know at 42 that you do not know at 20, that you do not always know what you are doing, and that the not knowing is information, and that the right thing to do with information is to follow it honestly wherever it goes. She wrote the letter in Lisbon in the second week of February. It was long because the accounting required length and honest, because honesty was the only method that had ever been available to her, and she had not found occasion to change it. She wrote about the examining and what she had found when she did it without urgency, that the fixed conclusions were less fixed than assumed, that the shipping routes did not require her presence in Lisbon specifically, that the office on the quay was closed, and the house let to tenants, and the things she could not do from elsewhere were considerably fewer than she had been treating them as being. She wrote about Mrs. Farrow, who had begun packing again in January without being asked, which was the most precise commentary available on the situation. She wrote about Rodrigo, about 20 years, and the key at 20, and the confidence that had been right, and about what she understood now that she had not understood at 22. That love was not a disruption to a life, but a direction for it, and that the direction was worth the cost of navigation, which she had always known how to do. At the end, in the plain register that was her truest voice, the examining is complete, the accounting is honest, the conclusion, which I reach with the full evidence and in full knowledge of what it requires, is this: Lisbon is where I know how to be myself, and I am bringing that self elsewhere, because elsewhere is where you are, and you are a column I do not intend to close. I sail on the 14th of March. I have given Mrs. Farrow the London address. Inez. She sealed it, and sent it before she could revise it into something more carefully managed, because revision in this specific case would have been its own kind of dishonesty, and she had been practicing the alternative long enough to know the difference. He met her at the dock in Southampton, not with the single bag this time, with the expression of a man who has received a letter in February and spent the intervening weeks doing his own examining, the result of which was entirely visible in his face, open, direct, entirely himself, with nothing managed and nothing contained. The grey eyes that had addressed all their correspondence correctly from the very beginning were doing what they had always done, which was to look at her specifically. Not at the abstract category of the situation, not at the social question, but at her. She came down the gangplank and found him on the dock and looked at him with the full attention she had been giving to this question since October, which had accumulated through the proceedings and the November bridge and the December departure and the Lisbon winter into something that was no longer a question at all. "The letter," she said. "Every line," he confirmed. The examining on my side was brief. The accounting had been complete since November. He held her gaze. "The conclusion was waiting for yours." Mrs. Farrow descended behind Inez with the 3 trunks and the comprehensive look of a woman who has said obviously at least 4 times over 6 months, and considers the present scene the full and satisfactory conclusion of each of those statements. "Southampton again," Inez said, looking at the dock, the grey English morning, the sea that was the same sea everywhere. "A transitional place," Thomas said. "Arrivals and departures." "Which is this?" He looked at her with the directness that had addressed all their correspondence correctly from the very beginning, the directness that had said of course when she asked to be present at all proceedings, and laid the folder out plainly, knowing it would cost him, and come to the dock in December for no professional reason at all, and prepared for every meeting at 8:30 so that she arrived to something ready rather than something still becoming ready. "Both," he said, "which is usually how the best ones are." She held out her hand, not the departure gesture this time, not the brief acknowledgement of a significant moment requiring marking, but the gesture of a woman who has completed her accounting with the full discipline of someone who does not flinch from the inconvenient entries and is ready for what the balance indicates, which was what it had been indicating since October if she had been willing to look at it directly. He took it. Mrs. Farrow supervised the transfer of the trunks to the waiting carriage, with the efficiency of a woman who finds the romantic proceedings entirely satisfactory, but also slightly in the way of the luggage, and the March morning continued its English operations around them, and the sea behind them was grey and indifferent, and entirely the same as every sea Inez Carvalho had ever sailed, vast and honest, and going where it was going with the patient certainty of something that has always known its direction. As, at last, did she. End. My dear listener, I thank you most sincerely for keeping company with this tender tale of the heart. It is my fondest hope that this Regency romance has brought you a measure of comfort, delight, and quiet reflection, as our dear characters journeyed through sorrow, hope, devotion, and the promise of enduring love. If this clean historical romance has pleased you, I would be most grateful